issues that affect our society. And today we are starting an interesting segment, which is understanding land concepts in Kenya, and of course emerging issues on land. I'm your host, Sally Mutai, and I'm joined by two experts who we will be doing this series with. They'll introduce themselves shortly. And so what we will do is that we will have different series where we unpack the land concepts in Kenya. And today we will start with the basics, just understanding what land is, what are our emerging issues when it comes to land in Kenya. Karibu, introduce yourself.
Asante, my name is Irene Kinoti, an urban planner by profession, very active lady in matters to do with justice for people living in both urban and rural areas, especially on matters access to land and housing. And yes, I work at Pamoja Trust.
And you can also add, and I'm a mother, and a wife,
and I'm a mom.
All those interesting things. Yeah, okay. Karibu.
Hi guys, my name is Tobias Ngonga. Tobias Ngonga is an urban planner focusing on access to land in the informal settlements, mostly in Kenyan urban areas, and with a bias on land data issues. Currently I work at Pamoja Trust. Thank you.
So just like I've mentioned today, we will break down the land concepts. But before we do anything, ni muhimu kuelewa what is land. What is land? Tobias.
Okay, thank you. Land, usually when we say land, watu wanafikiria ni mashamba zenye wako nazo. But we have land defined in our constitutional and legal framework, and the Constitution of Kenya, Article 260, defines land. And land specifically encompasses of the surface of the earth, under the surface of the earth, the water bodies, the natural resources, and the marine waters, which is under the Kenyan territory. So basically, according to the Constitution of Kenya, that is what land is.
Mm-hmm. In another word, it's kujus esolem, or something.
And I think I like the way he defined it, because most times when you interact with community persons and ask them about land, they'll describe it as mchanga. Every single place we've gone, watasema tu shamba ni mchanga. That's the basic definition people know about land.
Yeah, that's true. I think most people, or most community people, or just say people as a whole, always think of land as land that you can step on, like mchanga. But I think his description goes into even the seas. Mm-hmm. So if you come from Lake Victoria, if you come from near Lake Victoria, if you come from near the ocean, the water bodies also forms part of land. And I think that's what the Greek word for kujus, anything above the skies, anything below the ground, including the waters, then forms part of land. But when we look at land now in the context of our country, and also just understanding how we use land, how we own land, maybe Irene, you tell us how does ownership look like? What direction do the laws that we have tell us in how we can own land?
Yeah. So I think now that Tobias had already started with the Constitution of Kenya, and we always talk about the Constitution of Kenya being our major blueprint. Chapter 4 under the Bill of Rights, specifically under Article 40, speaks about the right to property ownership. And we see that the government of Kenya recognizes that people have the right to use, access, and control land as long as they are Kenyans and also non-Kenyans with certain conditions. And it also gives us the appreciation of how to what extent people can enjoy rights to land. And I think chapter 5 of the Constitution of Kenya speaks about land in totality. And I think one of the things that we need to appreciate is the principles on land that the Constitution of Kenya brings out strongly, because it talks about equality, it talks about security of land, it talks about gender issues, it talks about issues to do with disputes in regarding to land. And the Constitution then goes ahead to tell us which are the categorizations of land in Kenya. So in Kenya, we have public land, private land, and community land. And under each of the...
But before you go into maybe the categories that now the laws, specifically the Constitution, gives us or categorizes land into, you've mentioned that everyone, kila mtu, and regardless, and you also highlighted the principle, everyone has the right to inherit land. So having understood what land is, and also knowing that everyone, every single person, be it a man, a woman, children, have the right to own land, right? But also now you're directing us into maybe the categories that now the Constitution categorizes land. So maybe as you answer that, now you or not as you answer, you're not answering, we're discussing, having a discussion. As you discuss that, maybe you also say who can own what and what not.
So in terms of ownership of land, we have... All Kenyans can actually own land, and under the ownership you can own the land under the private ownership, either in freehold formation or leasehold formation. Freehold is what is most common in our rural areas. You have the full control over your land, but obviously the Constitution of Kenya also speaks about how the government can regulate how you use the land.
I think what we say, we always say, and feel free to interject at any point, absolute right. You have the absolute right, but of course, having in mind that the government also have eminent domain or have some rights, police rights to govern how you use that land.
And mostly that also comes because there's the aspect of development control. But then we can also own land under leasehold formations, and this is both for Kenyans and also the non-Kenyans. And all non-Kenyans own land under leasehold, and the leasehold period is normally a maximum of 99 years. Yes, I don't know what else you want to...
You see, you've also brought in, and Tobias, we have tenure types, and we also have categories, even before we delve deep into the categories. And she's mentioned the freehold. We have the freehold, and we have the leaseholds. Yes. So maybe we also discuss, because I think there's always also been a confusion when it comes to land discussion on what is the difference of categories of land and land tenure types.
Okay, we have the land tenure types, that is the leasehold and the freehold tenure. You realize that, as my colleague has said, leasehold land tenure system is mainly in the rural areas where people own land and there is no time limitation. They use that land, though the government has some policy rights on how to use the land because they are responsible for land use planning and management. Then we have also the leasehold land tenure, which mostly in Kenya is found in urban areas. And actually, there was a proposal that all land in urban areas should be under leasehold. And this is where the government gives you a condition. So you have limited rights over the land that you own, and it is renewable after a certain period of time. So if the government decides that they don't want to renew, then it means that you cease to be the user.
Is it the government that decides, or because you have some rights to this land and it's under leasehold? So what you're also saying is that leasehold is limited. You're given a certain duration, yes. And of course someone might be wondering what that duration would look like, because if we've heard of leases for 99 years, we've heard of people who have leases for 30 years, which I think is also something that we need to talk about maybe in a later series or episode. But can government decide I'm not going to renew your lease? And then also, how do I know if as a landowner that the title that I have is freehold or leasehold? Like if I was to tell from a document or a title document.
Okay, it's usually indicated whether the land that you have is leasehold or freehold. And if it is leasehold, at the expiry of the period given, you are supposed to renew the lease. And sometimes if you don't renew the lease, then the ownership automatically reverts to the government. And sometimes
so
also
the leasehold holder is given the first priority to renew.
Yes. Yeah, so you are given a priority to renew. And if you don't want to renew, well and good. If you want to renew, then you can renew. But at times, as you said, sometimes the government has overriding authority over land. So if maybe the land is to be used for something which is of national interest, then you may be requested to vacate the land, or you may be relocated to other areas, depending on the agreements that might take place during that time.
Yes, which is actually the power of government, the eminent domain power that government has in action when they want to use that land. And of course it has to be in the interest of the public, of the people, yes. Which I think are also discussions that we will have. But now we go back to maybe the categories to understand deeper. Irene ulisema tuko na 3 categories. No. Yeah. So make us understand, or make our audience understand, what are these categories?
So when we start with public land, so basically the Constitution of Kenya also tells us that land belongs to all the people of Kenya, all communities in Kenya, and all individuals in Kenya. But as we talk about the categorization of land in Kenya, we have public land, and this is basically the simple definition is land owned by the government. And in ownership, we can talk about where public infrastructure or public amenities and public related goods are located, and even in terms of natural resources and everything else that Tobias tried to describe regarding what land is. And the categorization of the public land, we have the county governments are the ones that are in charge of public lands. They hold the land on behalf of the people. But then even in this holding the land on behalf of the people, there's still a categorization. So there are those parcels of land that are held by the national government, and there are those lands that are held by the county government. But all the public land in Kenya is managed and administered by the National Land Commission. And then we have private land, and this is where we have a bigger part of the bigger chunk of the freehold tenure system. And private land is land owned by individuals in the country, and people have absolute control over the land, as Sally had put it out. And still within the private land, there is this aspect where the government can regulate the use of your private land for the public interest. And then finally, we have community land. Community land is land owned by a community, either in the ethnic groupings, community seated on a specific geographic location, people who share similar socioeconomic characteristics. And oftentimes than not, community lands are located, or the way we perceive them is they are located in the ASAL and semi-arid areas of the country. But one thing that maybe Kenyans also need to know is that community
and it's good to highlight, just as you continue, it's good to highlight that, because there's because I think when it comes to understanding community land, there has always been a confusion of is it lands that are only in ASL areas? Could it be land? I think there has been some sort of a confusion. Is it like ancestral land owned by a community of the same ethnic group and all that? So I think it's important you're saying that, and I want us maybe you highlight it even more so that we make people who have been having this confusion of what community land really is. And also on private land, you've also mentioned owned by an individual. Could it, if it's an individual, what about if it's a chama? Can a chama own a private land? What's an individual in that context? Yes.
So for community land, actually, it's the biggest percentage of Kenyan land. Majority of the land in Kenya is community land. And I think this takes us even back to history, because even before Mzungu akuje, land was owned communally. Even when the Mzungu was here, land was still owned communally. The only point where we started having individual forms of land ownership was immediately after independence. Yeah. That's when we started having title deeds issued to individuals at that point. So majority of the Kenyan land is communally owned. And it can exist both in the ASAL and the semi-arid areas, and also in the cities and the major towns. But the most challenging thing has been not only Kenyans, but also the government itself has had difficulties recognizing that community land can also be outside these ASAL and semi-arid areas. And that's but that's a discussion of another day. When we talk about community land, you'll find that the Community Land Act is currently being implemented predominantly in the ASAL areas. But for the private land, apart from individual ownerships, we can have groups owning land individually, and where we have maybe non-citizens coming in to own parcels of land, they have to show that there is the presence of a citizen in that grouping, so that the land can officially have some form of private ownership. Yeah.
And it's interesting that you're talking about historical, like going back to how we perceived land even historically, or we can say as Africans or indigenous people. There's always this conversation of who are indigenous people. Are you an indigenous African?
Yes, I am. I am an indigenous person.
What we perceive as indigenous people, for me, I think we are indigenous to Kenya, and so we are the indigenous people of Kenya. How we used to perceive land, I think we were more communal in many aspects, even away from land. But I want us to delve more into that, also looking at public land. And us as people who work with communities, and I mean Pamoja Trust, we also advocate for occupancy rights. And most of these people who have occupancy rights or user rights, of course, they do not have like absolute rights or ownership rights to land. But we acknowledge that our constitutions allow for occupancy rights and also user rights. So I wanted us to discuss it in regards to public land. If public land, as Irene has highlighted, is land that is, of course, it belongs to the people of Kenya, but it's governed by the government. And she has highlighted how national government can own some bits of public land, and also county government, not own, manages. Actually, the word there is manages, because we have said it's owned, belongs to the people of Kenya. If it's belong to the people of Kenya, it's owned by the people of Kenya entirely as a nation, right? So, talking about occupancy rights in public land, can individuals or Kenyans stay on public land, and what will be their relationship with land in that instance when it comes to occupancy rights?
Oh, thank you. I think before I delve into that, I wanted to add something on community land, especially in urban areas. You realize that the Constitution defines what a community land is. And one of the parameters of a community land is that there should be a common community interest, which we find also in urban areas. So, yes.
Not there should be, just so that when someone asks what else, there can be. Yes.
There can be.
Yes, it's an option like this. Yeah.
There can be community land in urban areas, but I think the focus has been in the rural areas and mainly in ASALs and semi-arid areas, because in those areas people still live communally, so they own land communally. Okay, coming back to the user rights or occupancy rights on public land. Land belongs to all of us as Kenyans, the people of Kenya. Land belongs to the people of Kenya. So the people of Kenya have the right to occupy and use land. In terms of ownership, the land may be owned by the government or managed by the National Land Commission, but the public should be able to use that land if it is not in use for the public good. So you realize that in some areas we have public land, it's idle. The government is not doing anything on that land. I am persuaded that as the people of Kenya, we have that leeway to use that land and to occupy that land.
Yes, I'm smiling because this is a very touchy, if not... Yes. And that's why we say that we will try and also unpack some of the concepts that maybe most people have been fighting to really understand. Because when you fight for example, or you advocate for the rights of people living in informal settlements, of course, most informal settlements, you acknowledge that some of them are private, some of them are public. And most people have always had the conversation of why are you advocating for their rights, yet it's not their land. And I think what you're trying to say is that the Constitution itself then gives these people occupancy rights, so they have rights to use. And a good example that I've always highlighted is that, is a road a public land or not? It is. Let's take, for example, a road that we know here in Nairobi, Mombasa Road, or even Wayaki Way. Is it a public land or not? It is. Do you have rights to use that land while coming to work every day? Yes. You use it you use it for transportation to move from wherever you want to go to. So that's like an example of, it's public land, it's managed by governments, but you have rights to use that land. And so that concept also applies in other scenarios. There is land, a vacant land owned, which is public land managed by government, but you decide to use it for housing, for example, or you decide to use it for business. So you've put a stall there, you're using it for business. Then, as the Constitution envisions that you have occupancy or user rights, then those rights have to be upheld. And I think what people don't understand is that is the right that you're advocating for this person to be able to fulfill, to realize that right of using that property. But I think it's a debate, and Irene, you can also add your thoughts into it.
And I think even as we talk about people, the public occupying public land, it still takes me back to the principles of land under the Constitution of Kenya. When it talks about equality, when it talks about security, when it talks about accessibility for all, there is no discrimination. So that's already a way for us to talk about what's the place of these people who do not have land. Where do they go to? The Constitution's principles already give them the allowance to feel there is some sort of security when they are accessing the land that is in Kenya. And I like the way you keep on talking about the occupancy rights. And I think for the viewers, it's critical for us to know that this is under the Article 40 of the Constitution, where the specific section speaks about the government has recognizes occupants in good faith. And these are people who can be able to benefit from instruments such as compensation in the form of, in the case they come across a situation where the government needs to acquire the land for other uses. Yeah.
Yeah. We are still on the bit of understanding the land. Just on the categories, but understanding it also historically. The reason why it's always also important to advocate for these rights that we are saying is a right. And also it's important, and I think you will highlight what we usually call
the continuum of land rights. Yeah.
Just understanding that land rights, because most people, even myself, if I want to feel like really my rights to land are fulfilled, is when I have a title deed. But there is a continuum that Irene will highlight to as a continuum of land rights that includes the user and the occupancy rights that you're talking about. And the reason why it's also important for us to advocate for these rights is because there is some historical background to it. There is some injustices that have never been addressed, that when you do not allow someone to then realize their occupancy rights, it's like umeua mtu kabisa. This person, because land is the basis of everything, this person cannot live if they're not able to, they do not have, first of all, their rural home. Is it rural home or ancestral? They cannot trace back where really their ancestral home is, or they cannot realize other rights, for example, their economic rights by doing businesses, because they do not have access to land. And why I'm categorizing this as historical is because of the historical justices that we've had in Kenya. Just understanding how Irene had mentioned that initially we were before colonization, we owned our lands communally, and then with the coming of colonizers, I wanted to say white settlers, with the coming of colonizers, the perception of owning land, private ownership and titling came in, and that was perceived to be sustainable use of land. Like you could only use land sustainably and effectively up to the maximum if you have a title deed. If you own it communally, then it is perceived become uko na shamba, but you're not maximizing its use. So it's not, I don't know if the word is sustainable, you're maximizing its use. Like it's not bearing any fruit for the country and even for you. And I think we need to discuss more on how the coming of the colonized, the historical perception of, how do I put it? Not historical perception. How the influence of the colonizers and the perception of having title deeds has then affected how we relate to land today, and the injustices that it has caused, and why it's important for us to advocate for user rights and also occupancy rights for our citizenry. Any thoughts on
Yes, we can start with Tobias.
Okay, it's fun.
First of all, do you agree that as Kenyans, South Africans, our main business with land is to hold it communally?
Okay, previously...
no, do you agree, yes or no?
Yes, I agree. I agree.
You're not sure?
I agree because before the colonial people came, our communities used to own land communally, and they were doing production as usual. They were rearing cattle, they were farming, and they were getting food, and they had social life, and things were good. Historically, when the colonialists came, then they introduced the individual titling system. That messed up everything. So you realize that when they came first, there were injustices that took place because they were looking for fertile land. So you realize that, for example, in Kenya, those who are the communities who are residing in fertile areas, they were displaced. Yeah, so displacements took place, and people were sent to other areas which were not more productive. Then the productive areas were taken over by the colonialists, the so-called the White Islands and the settler farms and the rest. Yeah, so you realize that when this happens, then of course we gained our independence. After the independence, then this continued because the people who enter into power, they maximized this and acquired the land which were taken away from the native Africans forcefully and in a way that is not right. So you realize that even currently, most of our people who occupy public land, because they don't have land, historically you will realize that they were displaced. They were just displaced. Yeah, yeah. It's because of historical injustices that has happened. So I think historical occurrences has really influenced our perception when it comes to land ownership, because when the individual titling system was introduced, then we bought it. And we realized that now we learned that if you don't own an individual title deed, then it's like you don't have access to land. Yeah, which is not the truth actually.
So I'm just thinking to myself, so is the law clear? Because people usually say the law is clear. So most times when you deal with people who, for example, I don't want to say people, but experts, maybe land experts who are in mainstream, maybe government, the blueprint is always the laws, right? So if someone challenges you with anything, you go back to what the law says. Do you have title to this land? Then why are you here? Why is it? So is the law really clear? And when it comes to land, is it important for us to also understand the historical background to it?
Yeah. So I actually love this subject of historical land injustices. Is the law clear? The law is trying to be clear, but then it has not really unpacked all the underlying issues.
The law is clear. The law is very clear. But as someone who advocates for social justice, you also have to understand certain concepts.
Yes, and I think that's why we keep on saying that the National Land Commission really has to deal with the issues of historical land injustices. You see, when everyone talks about land, people will say that land is emotive. But the other day, I remember I was talking to a person from the Ministry of Lands, and he was saying that land is not emotive. People are the ones who have emotions on the land. And it still takes us to historical land injustices, and I'll use this example. So the other day, I was working with someone close to these new cities. I'll not mention one of it. So the specific one. And he told me that a colleague of his told him that this land where this city is built on belonged to his great-grandfather. And up till date, he doesn't like passing close to that city because that land was grabbed by the white settlers. It's close to these nice highland areas. And you can see the extent to which colonialism has affected the way we feel about land to date. And there is no way I'll feel secure about a specific portion of land if I don't have a title, because there is still that fear that at any given time, mtu atakuja achukue shamba yangu. And it also reminds me of the history of the colonial government when they came in 1896. I think their period was 1896 to 1962. And immediately those people left the country.
I like the way you're saying those people. Underline.
Immediately those people left the country. This country became a mess in terms of land issues. Even people who are doing planning, they left land management issues and everything focused on land administration. Land administration, and remember when you talk about land administration, it's about titling processes. And this is why the scramble was, how do we get these lands so that we can give people titles, and then even areas where we wanted to set aside for public lands that's the point public lands were actually taken away, and people were being given individual parcels of land.
Which is also another historical injustice.
That's still another historical land injustice, and it's sad to see that even the National Land Commission is yet to unpack how to deal with these historical land injustices, because it's become a thorn in the flesh, and the challenges that emanated from those injustices continue to grow day by day.
Yeah, I just want to highlight something, because you said that of course the National Land Commission and the government in entirety have been facing challenges, and even us, like just Wanjiku. When it comes to land issues, land challenges, land disputes, it's become very difficult, and I think we'll have another conversation on maybe what are the right mechanisms to deal with land disputes. And I think we have seen, when you talk about, you see, like for example, your friend was telling you, he has the knowledge that this land was my grandfather's. Yeah. So you can't take that issue to court based on like evidence, like straight jackets evidence. You need to deviate kidogo and find maybe a customary way to resolve it. And that leads us into how we can also use alternative justice system to resolve land dispute, and why it's important to mainstream NGIS when it comes to land dispute. I think the topic of historical land issues is broad, and I think maybe in other segments we will continue to highlight the historical issues. So one thing that you've always wanted people to know about land.
Okay,
maybe we end at that point.
One thing that I've always wanted people to know about land is that, now it takes me back to what we were talking about, land tenure. So recently I was trying to read a lot about land tenure, and as much as the government of Kenya has described land tenure in Kenya as either freehold or leasehold, it's good to understand land tenure as a component that what you're trying to highlight, a continuum of land rights. It's a bundles of land rights. It doesn't have to be defined either as freehold land or leasehold land. We need to look at land broadly, and when we look at land broadly, that's the point we'll manage to see how we can deal with the complex land issues that are in the country. If we limit our minds to the radical title, we limit our minds to is this leasehold land, is this freehold land, then we will not be able to deal with a lot of land issues that also come from the historical challenges. Yeah.
I think I'll copy paste that as something that I've always wanted people to know. So
do you want me also to copy paste that? Anyway, I think the most important thing that I would really like people to know about land is that the land in Kenya belongs to us all, the people of Kenya.
All land belongs to the people of
all land in Kenya belongs to the people of Kenya.
And shall be used.
And Kenyans need to know this, because you realize that sometimes when we use the public land, then it's like we are using the public land at what? at the mercy of the government agencies, yet the land belongs to us. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, as you can see, land is always a discussion that can take a lot of time. But as we've promised, we'll have other segments where we'll continue to unpack these issues. I have been your host, Ms. Miruri, and be sure to like our social media platforms. Whatever platform that you'll be watching this podcast from, we'll be posting on Facebook. We'll also be posting on our YouTube pages, and also we have an account on Spotify that we'll be sharing with you as well. Thank you so much. If you have any questions on land that you may want us to address as we continue having this series, be sure to put them in the comment section. Thank you, and we're out.
Adios.
Adios.